So, good morning, class. For this video, what we will be discussing is PAS number 41, which is all about agriculture. Okay, so this standard will discuss items about biological assets and agricultural produce. So before we proceed to the discussion of the standard, let's have first the outline for this video discussion. First and foremost, we have to identify, or we will identify the scope of PAS number 41, alin po ang kasama at alin po ang hindi kasama sa ina-account under PAS 41, as well as we will define certain terminologies or key definition of terms. Also, we will know what are the criteria for recognition. We will know the principles or the concepts to be followed in terms of measurement, and of course in terms of presentation and the necessary disclosure. So first, let's have the scope of our PAS number 41. So, based on the standard, PAS 41 applies to the following. Number 1, we have of course our biological assets. Except bearer plants. Number 2, we have agricultural produce. And please take note, when we say agricultural produce, ang kasama lang po sa PAS number 41 are those agricultural produce at the point of harvest. And number 3, we have unconditional government grants related, of course, to our biological assets. On the other hand, ang mga hindi po kasama sa standard or hindi po kasama sa items accounted for under PAS number 41 is yung kauna-unahan, we have your land. Okay, there is a possibility na meron pong land, most of the time merong land related to our agricultural activity. If it is not covered by PAS number 41, instead, as a land, it will be covered either by PAS 16, PAS 16, or PAS 40. The property, plant, and equipment, or the investment property. Second one, as mentioned doon kanina, yung bearer plants ay hindi kasama. Okay? Why? Because bearer plants are to be recognized or to be accounted for using PAS number 16. Okay? However, please take note na yung agricultural produce ng ating bearer plants is within the scope of PAS 14. Number 3, if the bearer plants ay hindi covered, of course, yung mga government grants related to the bearer plants, hindi rin siya covered. Instead, ang makaka-cover sa kanya is yung PAS number 20. Okay, so PAS 20 ang covered po. Ang covered ng PAS 20 ang government grants related to bearer plants. And number 4, if there are intangible assets related to agricultural activity. So this is not covered din po also. Instead, it will be covered under PAS number 38, which is the particular standard for intangible assets. Okay po. So, considering the scope of our PAS number 41, we have mentioned here some terminologies, and it's very important to first identify or define what are these terminologies. First, of course, we have our biological assets. Okay, so pag sinabi po nating biological assets, ito po yung mga living animals and plants. Living animals and plants, we have our sheep, we have our sugarcane plant, we have our pigs, dairy cattle, and among others, living animals and plants. Kapag sinabi naman nating agricultural produce, so ito po yung harvested product, or ito yung mga galing or products noong ating biological assets, harvested product from our biological assets. And since na-mention po natin yung harvested product, it's proper also for us to define what do we mean by harvest. So, kagaya lang ng pag-harvest ng halimbawa harvest ng palay, when we say harvest, this is the detachment of produce from biological assets. So kapag inalis natin yung agricultural produce sa biological assets, the process or the term being used is harvest. Now, as example ng biological assets, kagaya ng nasabi ko, pigs, sheep, sugarcane. In terms of agricultural produce naman, samples natin, wool, harvested cane, milk. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, sila yung kinukuha or napuproduce natin through our biological assets. Na, like for example, nanganak yung baboy na inianak, it's not an agricultural produce. It's actually another living animal. Right? Okay. So, that is the biological assets in the agricultural produce. Aside from that, let us define also agricultural activity. Yung agricultural activity naman, it is actually the management of or management by the entity nung process of transformation or harvest. Okay, management by the entity of the biological transformation. So, ano pong ibig sabihin ng biological transformation? Di ba? Meron tayong mga alagang hayop. So, syempre, itong mga halagang hayop natin, in order na ma-serve nito yung kanyang purpose, like for example, makakuha tayo ng gatas sa kanila or makapag-create sila ng panibagong living animal, then it must be, or it will transform. And the process or the management of that biological transformation as well as the harvest is known to be the agricultural activity. So, ano yung mga samples ng agricultural activity natin? O halimbawa, nag-aalaga tayo ng baboy, or nagko-cultivate tayo ng mga plantations, mga fish farming. So, those are examples of agricultural activity. You're literally managing the transformation, the biological transformation, as well as the harvest of the biological assets and agricultural produce. Now, as I've mentioned, meron tayong tinatawag na biological transformation. Now, kapag kasi sinabi nating biological transformation, ano yung ibig sabihin niya? So, ang ating living plants and animals are transforming when they undergo process of growth. Okay, pag sinabi nating growth, ang growth ng isang biological assets can be characterized by its quantity and by its quality. So, kapag quantity yung pinag-uusapan natin, of course, nagkakaroon ng increase sa quantity. Okay? Kapag quality naman ang pinag-uusapan natin, pag quality po, anong nangyayari? Nagkakaroon ng improvement sa quality ng ating biological assets. But aside from that, in the process of transformation, there is a possibility na instead of growing, nagkakaroon ng degeneration. So, the degeneration is actually just the opposite of the growth, where there is a decrease in quantity and also some deterioration in terms of quality. Okay? Also, ang posible pang mangyari sa ating biological assets is mag-undergo siya ng procreation. So, procreation, so it means nagkakaroon ng additional living animal and plants. So, pag nanganak ang ating biological assets, so that is a procreation. Now, also, bukod dito sa tatlong possible biological transformation, nagkakaroon din ng production. No? Ano tong production na to? It pertains now ngayon doon sa ating tinawag kanino or dinefine kanina na agricultural produce. Okay, so halimbawa, yung gatas na nakuha mo. Halimbawa, meron kang baka. So kapag yung baka, nanganak ng baka, obviously, baka yung iaanak nun, so that is procreation. Pero kapag meron kang nakuha na gatas doon sa baka, that's not procreation. Instead, it is known as production of agricultural produce. Okay, so those are the terms that we need to define in order to understand better the concept of PAS number 41. Okay, now let's go to, so we are done with the scope, we are done with the definition. Now let's go to the recognition of the assets under PAS 41. So since this is a biological asset, obviously it will be classified as asset, as an element of financial statements. And when we talk about the recognition of asset, we will follow, of course, your criteria or condition. Okay, in condition for the recognition. So the first criteria must be the entity must have control over the asset. So saan nanggaling yung control na yan? That is coming from past event. Just like any other asset, the entity must have control over it. The second one, of course, since it is an asset, you are expecting future economic benefits that will flow to the entity, and that future economic benefits is probable to happen. So probable that our future economic benefits will flow to the entity. And of course, aside from that, yung panghuli, of course, yung measurement of fair value or the cost, it must be measured reliably. So these are the three conditions or criteria that must be satisfied before the recognition of our biological assets. Now, kailan po natin masasabi na there is a control? So, of course, control is evidenced by, for example, legal ownership of cattle, and the branding or otherwise marking of the cattle on acquisition or birth. So, your control over the biological assets will restrict others from benefiting on the same item. Okay? And then, of course, after the recognition, once you identified na yes, they qualify or they meet the condition or criteria for recognition, the next thing to do, of course, is to measure it. No? So, in terms of measurement naman, po, our biological assets must be measured on the initial recognition and at the end of the reporting period. Ibig pong sabihin, initial recognition and subsequent recognition, it must be recognized at fair value less cost to sell or cost of disposal. Okay po? And aside from that, kapag kaya naman po agricultural produce ang pinag-uusapan, it must be measured at fair value. Same din. Okay, fair value less cost to sell. Or cost of disposal. And please take note, ito po ay sa point of harvest. This is fair value less cost of disposal na to applicable to agricultural produce, even to the agricultural produce of growing bearer plants. Okay? Alright po. So now, what will happen if, sabi natin dito kasi, the biological assets upon or in the initial recognition must be recognized at fair value less cost of disposal or less cost to sell. Now, subsequent to the initial recognition, it will be recognized also at fair value less cost of disposal. Now, the question is, what if the fair value cannot be measured reliably? What will happen? Of course, upon the initial recognition, it will always be the fair value less cost to sell. However, after or subsequent to the initial recognition, the scenario is the fair value cannot be measured reliably. And if that is the case, then our biological assets will be recorded as at its cost less any accumulated depreciation or accumulated impairment loss. Okay? So, in terms naman po of agricultural produce, o pag-usapan natin sa agricultural produce in details. So, as mentioned, its initial recognition is at fair value less cost of disposal. And as mentioned here, the fair value must be at the point of harvest. Now, this is initial recognition. Okay? But in terms of subsequent recognition, since agricultural produce are already harvested na, subsequently, hindi na po siya covered ng PAS 41. Okay? So, once po na ang agricultural produce ay na-harvest na, ang subsequent recognition na niya is under PAS number 2. Because it is now treated as inventory. And since inventory, PAS number 2 na yung co-cover sa kanya, its subsequent measurement now is its net realizable value. Okay? Ayan. So, pag-usapan naman po natin yung ating tinatawag na gains and losses. Okay, ma'am, bakit po may mga gains and losses tayong pinagpag-uusapan dito? Because, as mentioned, ang ating valuation or ang ating measurement is fair value. At dahil fair value yan, napakalaki po ng posibilidad na ang fair value ay nagbabago. Okay? So therefore, if there are changes in the fair value less cost to sell or less cost of disposal, we have to account for the gains and losses on the change in fair values. Okay? Aside from that is we also have to account for the gain or loss on initial recognition of agricultural produce. O, bakit naman po magkakaroon ng gain or loss on the initial recognition of agricultural produce? So, halimbawa, meron kang sheep. So yung agricultural produce natin doon is the wool. So, when you harvested the wool on or from the sheep, wala tayong ma-identify doon na naging gastos natin. So, we will be recognizing an asset, pero hindi naman tayo nagbayad ng pera. So wala tayong i-credit in that case. So, instead of leaving it or not recording it, you will recognize the asset as the agricultural produce and at the same time recognize gain or loss on that initial recognition. So, yung gain or loss yung ipapartner mo doon sa asset na i-recognize mo. Okay? Also, there is a gain or loss on initial recognition naman ng biological asset. O halimbawa, nagkaroon ng procreation ng anak, hindi mo naman binili yung anak nung baka, for example. But you have to recognize the additional or the created or additional living animal as an asset, as a biological asset. So, ipapartner mo ngayon doon is a gain or loss on initial recognition of biological assets. Okay. Now, let's talk about naman gain or losses on changes in fair value. So, di ba sabi natin dito, meron tayong changes in a fair value less cost of disposal. Okay? So, saan ba nanggagaling or ano ba yung reason bakit nagkakaroon ng change sa fair value? Okay po. So, yung fair value natin, yung changes ng fair value natin might be first due to price change. Ibig sabihin, literally, ang nagbago ay yung presyo. Parang halimbawa, yung 1-year-old na baka, ang value niya ngayon ay 100 or 30,000. Pero ang value niya noon, yung 1-year-old na baka noon ay mas mababa sa 30,000. So, the change is due to price. And if the change is due to price, the way to record or the way to compute it is you get the fair value less cost to sell at the end of the period. Like for example, December 31 of 2020. Ang hahanapin mong fair value less cost to sell ay yung age niya at the beginning. So, ayan po yung 1-year-old, for example. And then, you will deduct from it the fair value less cost to sell at the beginning of the period using the same age. Ibig pong sabihin, hindi nagbago yung age na pag-uusapan natin. Instead, ang mag-iiba ngayon is yung fair value niya nung beginning at saka nung end. Okay. Now, posible rin po na ang reason ng fair value or changes in the fair value is due to physical change. Okay? Ibig pong sabihin, ang pagbabago ay hindi sa presyo kung hindi sa physical change. At kapag ka po ganun, ang pagkukumpute po nun, you will be getting the fair value less cost of disposal at the end. At kung ilang taon na siya nung end ng accounting period. Ibabawas mo ngayon dito yung fair value less cost to sell still at the end nung age niya, nung beginning of the period. Okay? So in this case, physical change yung iyong tiningnan. That's why ang magkaiba or ang i-consider natin is the change in the age. Unlike kanina, na since price change yung pinag-uusapan, ang kinonsider natin is the change in the prices. Okay? So, ayan po yung in terms of measurement. Okay? So, basically, ayun yung accounting for the measurement of biological assets, measurement of agricultural produce, as well as the measurement of the gains and losses. Okay? So, that's basically the accounting for PAS 41 or the agriculture. In terms of presentation in the financial statements, of course, it is to be presented as part of our biological assets. O, sige, sulat po natin in terms of presentation and disclosure po. So, saan siya ipapresent? Of course, sa ating financial statements in the year-end statement. Particularly, ilalagay po siya natin sa financial position. Why? Because of course, this is an asset. It will be classified as biological assets. And kung maaalala natin doon sa PAS number 1, ang biological assets po natin is a separate line item. Okay? Biological assets will be classified as part of the non-current asset. And of course, yung mga gains and losses computed here, since gains and losses yan, presented sa income